These we ask in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. PAC chaplain? No, he's reluctant. He's reluctant. All right. All right, I'll give you a break next week. So far, so good. All right. Apologies for absence. I have an apology from Minister Warmington, and member Lisa Hanna says she will be a little bit late this morning. Those are the only two persons I've heard from. We will move to item 4 of the agenda, welcome and opening remarks. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome Auditor General and her team. Welcome team from the Ministry of Finance. We will be having the team from the Ministry of Transport and Mining. Are they here?
Yeah, the PS is here. He's waiting on Transport Authority.
Okay. So the PS is here apparently, and he's waiting on the. It's a man or woman?
Dr. Hayes, yes.
Yes. Yeah, waiting on the team from the Transport Authority. We also have with us in the gallery a group from the University of Alabama. One lecturer and 14 students. Welcome to our parliament and nice to have you. Great. Okay. We will move to the minutes of the last meeting, and which we can go through page by page as we normally do. Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6. There's an error on page 6 in the second paragraph. I'd say it's line 9 perhaps, which ends with the word seniors. It should be senior citizens. S should be removed. Senior citizens, yeah. Page 7, page 8, page 9. On page 9, there's something that doesn't seem quite right. In the paragraph under the caption, the National Insurance Fund, Equity Management, the very bottom, last sentence, and this is making reference to the PS from that ministry, Labor and Social Security. It says, she added that based on particular investment, varying degrees of analyses were done when there was a new investment, and that for soft cases, such as bonds and securities. I don't think she said for soft cases. I think it definitely wasn't soft cases, no. I think you can remove the word soft. Yeah. Let's say for cases such as bonds and stocks, all right? Page 10, there's one correction on page 10. In the final big paragraph, the sentence 2/3 along the paragraph where it says he suggested that this was an opportune time to have a proper legal review of the arrangements to determine what ought to be in place to ensure the proper custodian, should say custodianship, of these assets. All right? Custodianship of these assets. Apart from that, I don't have any issues with the minutes. Does anyone have any issues with the minutes? If not, would somebody move for their adoption, please? Moved by member Dunn, seconded by member Guy. Thank you. So the minutes are approved as amended. And we move to matters arising. Madam Clerk, there are a couple of matters arising for me from these minutes. First of all, on page 4, there was a discussion about the lack of clarity around some of the issues that came up out of the path-related project. And there's the minutes indicated that Mrs. Monroe Ellis said she would, well, there are two things. First of all, the chairman asked for the Ministry of Labor and Social Security to clarify this in writing to the committee in time for its next meeting. So there is that, and there's also that Mrs. Monroe Ellis indicated that she would she needed clarity on 2 points, and she would report back to the committee on this matter, though not by this next meeting. So I'm just pointing out that there are 2 things that need to be followed up.
Right.
Yeah.
Up to this morning,
Yes.
the Ministry of Labour said they were working on the response. They hadn't
Okay.
completed it.
Okay. So they're working on it. All right. Well, hopefully they will have it for the next meeting. And Mrs. Monroe, I guess you said there were 2 issues you wanted clarified, and you would, in due course, report back to us when you're ready. Then, on page 8 of the minutes, there's the chairman had asked that an orientation to path for political representatives, well, the point was made that an orientation to path for political representatives would be useful, and the PS said the ministry will prepare something for circulation. So I'd like that followed up on as well, that especially new MPs but all MPs would benefit from a better understanding of how PATH works and what are the different points in which MPs may have an interest or be able to intervene if necessary to defend the rights of their constituents. And then on the same page, in relation to non-compliance with tax guidelines resulting from salary overpayments, the whole question of the withholding tax treatment of gratuity payments was discussed, and there's apparently more than one view. And I think we should seek clarification on it from the tax TAJ commissioner. I think the Commissioner General should be written to ask what is the TAJ's position on this issue, as it appears to be one where there has not been a consistency in the treatment of the issue. So I think that would be useful to crystallize that. So if we could do that, please. Those are the only matters arising that I have. Any other matters arising? If not, we can move to item 7 of the agenda, which is a review of the Auditor General's report on the performance audit of the Transport Authority in relation to the regulation of public passenger vehicles, PPVs. Could we invite the Ministry personnel and the Transport Authority personnel?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. Morning, PS. Perhaps we could just begin by asking you to introduce yourself and your team for the record.
As I was saying, Mr. Chairman, yes, that's much better. Let me apologize for the late arrival of the Managing Director of the Transport Authority, Mr. Cecil Morgan, who is key to this hearing this morning. He'll be arriving anytime now. I sincerely apologize. He apparently was involved with the minister at another venue. With me here is the Director of Corporate Planning and Performance Monitoring, Mrs. Dawn Smith-Fagan. I also have the Senior Director of Transport Policy, Ms. Tanya Bedward, sitting immediately behind me, and I have our Principal Finance Officer, Mr. Richard DePaz, sitting to my left behind.
Thank you. Thank you, Pierce. Well, perhaps I could then ask if the Auditor General would just give us an overview of the pertinent issues that she has brought to our attention for today.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. So the performance audit of the Transport Authority was undertaken to determine whether TA's regulation of public passenger transport, the public passenger transport sector was effective in reducing illegal activities. And this was undertaken in the context of TA's mandate to ensure compliance among the public transport operators. There are a number of findings emanating from this audit, which would have been summarized in the prompts, but I will just go through. There are 5 main findings. The first really elucidates the concern that we have regarding the issuing of summonses by the TA and what appears to be the lack of effectiveness in ensuring compliance among members in the sector. We were also concerned that though TA did in fact issue summonses on a regular basis, and the details in the report will actually underscore that, the entity did not take into consideration the summonses issued to the operators in considering renewals. And in fact, what they took into consideration were the tickets issued and whether those tickets had been cleared. But they did not take into consideration the offenses arising from their own activity, which TA actually issues summonses, whereas the police issues the tickets, which we thought that was a major flaw, especially as in light of the fact that they are seeking to ensure that there's compliance among the members. The other concern, and I'm a little, Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering if I may have to repeat some of this. I'm hoping that I will not have to do that, because I know that there are probably differences of views, especially as it pertains to the data that we have and in the response provided by the TA. And one is in relation to the supply of the PPVs, which we said we believe fostered some of the illegal activities. A survey undertaken by TA revealed that there was a greater need for the take-up of these PPVs than was actually supplied or being taken up. So you had a larger population of illegal operators than registered operators. And of course, as TA has said, it's really a voluntary exercise. You can't force someone to become registered. But what our records show, which I think that's a point of difference with TA, but it is something that I believe can be clarified here, is that on expiration of the licenses, the rate of renewal is actually reducing. And whereas the rate of non-renewal is increasing, the rate of application for license is actually decreasing. So it could be that the operators probably find it more profitable not to register. I don't know what it is, but there's clearly a trend towards not registering. The third item, I will skip over, Mr. Chairman, and I'll go to the fourth, which that can be discussed, and that is in relation to the procurement activities of the TA in terms of the purchase of the Jamintel building, as well as the acquisition of buses, which appear to, at this point in time, to be nugatory expenditure. No benefit has been garnered from these expenditure, and our concern is that it appears that sufficient due diligence was not undertaken before engaging in this type of activity, Mr. Chairman. And I believe I can stop there for now.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Auditor General. Okay, so we have a prompt before us, and the Auditor General has given an overview of the main issues for this morning. And with respect to the first issue, I am very interested in understanding why it would be that the Transport Authority, which has the leverage of granting and renewing licenses, would not take into account outstanding summonses that it has itself issued to licensees in determining whether or not to renew a license. It warrants an explanation. So that's the first question I would ask.
That, Mr. Chairman, is a policy that needs to be examined and indeed implemented at the Transport Authority. There's no reason why something like that could not be entrenched as part of the regulations, so that persons who have had summonses, who have been in breach repeatedly, should not be
Mr. Chairman,
allowed to renew.
When I get these kind of answers, it's probably pointless trying to address these without the managing director of the Transport Authority being here, because we're just going, get waffling from the PS. And, I am, especially when we see the headlines in the paper today with the deepening scandal at Petrojam, I feel very conscious that we're diverting the resources of the Auditor General's office from investigating this very urgent scandal that we have there, and to come here to hear the PS waffling because he, quite rightly, is not the operating officer for the Transport Authority, and we don't have the person here to give an account for their stewardship. Questions like these are things we raised years ago with the Transport Authority about using this from I was Minister of National Security, about using the record, the driving record, in terms of renewing the badges. And in fairness to the PS, I don't know if he was there then or not, but we must hear from the Transport Authority officials why this slackness is still going on.
They're now half an hour late. I don't know if, we're expected to just cater for their tardiness. And, I don't know. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, perhaps you could call.
We are expecting any time now, Mr. Chairman. As I was saying, though, on this matter, whereas in the Road Traffic Act, there are clear provisions for that will make it impossible or difficult for persons to renew their registration, to renew their licenses when they are repeatedly in breach. We need similar provisions in the Transport Authority Act. And the member said I'm waffling, and indeed it's so to a certain extent, but we don't know that this.
Point of order.
Mm-hmm.
in light of my colleague's intervention just now, are we going to suspend that discussion and wait until the... Because it seems as if we're just going to be going in circles. One of the reasons, Chairman, just to support my colleague, why, as a procedure, the operating officers in the entities appears with the AG, because it is the entities that gives the response to the AG and not the ministry central. They might come through the ministry, but they come from the entity. So it serves no purpose for us to be... So just guide me what we're going to do, Mr. Chair. That's my point of order.
No, the permanent secretary had indicated he wanted to complete his point, so I was paying him the courtesy of allowing him to do so. But clearly this issue, has already been pointed out, is one in which the Transport Authority's input is critical, and since you're not in a position really to speak for them, apparently, on the matter, it puts us in a bit of a quandary, because we're all here waiting to deal with the business of the country, and we can't proceed. And there are people in here who are very busy people, so this is totally unacceptable. And yeah.
There is something that the Permanent Secretary might be able to answer in the question that I have here, and if you'll allow me. And it deals with point number 2, AG. PS, I know you are not the originator of policy, but certainly are integral in the formation of policy by the respective ministry, whichever one you're serving. I find it a little disheartening, however, that the AG is reporting, and based on the reply of the Transport Authority, in 2016-2017, 7,584 spaces were made available for route taxis, rural stage carriage, contract carriages, and hackney carriages, while the take-up was only 44%. But yet the minister comes to the Parliament and indicates that he's opening up the entire route taxi operations. I would have expected that if there was a demand greater than the number of spaces there, then in the spirit of competition, then you'd open it. But these figures don't support the point that he's making, in that we want to open the system. We have a system here of 7,000 plus spaces, and the take-up is only 44%. Was the Transport Authority consulted, or advice sought or requested or bounced off in coming up with such a policy?
You are reading from what page of what document? Mm-hmm. Issue what? Issue 2. Mm-hmm. I don't have that. I don't think that's the prompt. That's not the prompt. That's not the prompt.
That's just the response.
Okay. Yes. Well, P.S. The question asked is about the...
I should point out, Mr. Chairman, that this, among other measures announced by the minister in his presentation to the sectoral debate, is contingent on a 6-month period of stakeholder consultation. So it's not cast in concrete, it's a policy measure that was announced, but he did say that these measures are going to be subject to public and stakeholder consultation over a 6-month period. That's a measure about opening up the
so you announce
the licensing
first,
regime.
and then you study. You make the announcement first, and then you go and study to see if it's complete nonsense you've announced. That's what you're confirming for us now, which was obvious from the point. I mean, this is another, used car policy where it is not thought through, it is not researched, and then it's just announced before any research.
Yes. Yeah. Member Phillips.
Chair. Morning, Chair. PS, just on the issue of revocation, does the Transport Authority or the ministry itself, with the Transport Authority, I understand that there's a policy, a revocation policy that has been sitting down, that has not been completed to help to guide the issue of revocation of license. You have any idea if that is now being completed, or is it still in limbo, the issue on that?
No, I'm not able to speak on that. I'm not aware of that policy.
All right. The issue of the merger of the Island Traffic Authority and the Transport Authority, which was also integral to do with the current Road Traffic Act that was just recently passed in Parliament. When I looked in the budget for this financial year also, I see no line item to deal with that merger. And is that from your office? Is that now taking place, or is it still, what is the situation with that?
Well, in terms of the merger, we are now preparing to go back to Cabinet for approval, or final approval, to proceed with the implementation of that merger. The provision in the budget, the request was not granted, but we have identified some funds that came from the amnesty that we are hoping to use to start the process during this financial year.
So it is still on. And do you have a time frame on when? Because it is going to be useless that the Road Traffic Act itself is then promulgated, and we have not had that merger done, because this has been in the pipeline for quite a while. So that once the act comes into effect, then both entities would have been merged to make, also to assist the act in itself in being effective. So we are, to what you're describing is that we are behind now in the merger of both entities.
I wouldn't say we are behind, but in fact we are very advanced in the process. We have put all the documentations together, and we are expecting to get the approval of the Cabinet. We are yet to return to Cabinet. We are expecting to return to Cabinet within the next 4 weeks to get approval to proceed.
Why I ask, PS, is because we basically took 2 years to carry that act through the Parliament itself. And right? No. Well, remember it came back, and then you took 2 years to basically complete it, but the regulations have not been completed. And when you look at the Transport Authority itself, there are only about 3 items that they can prosecute or to issue warrants on.
Right.
For summons. You are having a ratio of 6 illegal taxes to every 1 legal. I would have thought that the importance of dealing with what is happening out on the roads right now, especially in the KMTR, that there would be some urgency in dealing with the act itself, in getting because the Island Traffic Authority is supposed to be the holder of repository of where the ticketing information should be held. The Island Traffic Authority is very integral, the Transport Authority also is very integral in dealing with the public transport sector and the act itself. So when it is that we have taken 2 years to bring the act itself back to Parliament, to pass it, it has not yet come into being because we still don't have the regulations, and I pray to God that it doesn't take another 2 years to get the regulations together. But while we sit down and we fiddle, Rome continues to burn. And it's very disheartening on the response itself, seeing that the merger of the island, both entities should have happened from the previous administration, has not happened. and we are still talking about cabinet submission, and you know, it's a bit disheartening because this report in itself, and I have quite a few more questions, so when the managing director comes, it doesn't leave me comfortable, and the public itself, I'm sure, that we are dealing with the matter of just a public transport sector with urgency. And even that Road Traffic Act that we spent months inside here dealing with, and we still can't get it into being. It's Chairman, it is.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
the merger of the Island Traffic Authority and the Transport Authority indeed would address some of the issues that were raised in the report, in that regulatory and enforcement works were being done by different entities. And this new land transport agency would bring everything together, because the Island Traffic Authority deals primarily with the Road Traffic Act, while the Transport Authority is dealing with the Transport Authority Act. And then there are some licensing regime that the Transport Authority also handles, while the Inland Revenue Department handles some of the other licensing regimes. So this Land Transport Authority would bring everything under one authority. Yeah. Intrinsic in that is some modernization as well, to ensure that the information technology systems are in place to deal with the enforcement and regulatory functions of the
Do you anticipate
of the
that
entity.
more legislation is required to achieve that merger, or is it adequately dealt with in the legislation that we have?
Okay. In terms of what we have been directed to do by Cabinet, that is to establish the authority, to look at establishing the authority as an executive agency, we are able to proceed with the current legislation, because the executive agency really can still relate to the authorities, that is the statutory bodies that are in place. So the Transport Authority is a statutory body. The Island Traffic Authority, by virtue of the Road Traffic Act that is to be passed, is also a statutory body. And the executive agency will relate to that statutory body in a manner similar to how
we're creating a third
NEPA.
body. When we're supposed to be merging two into one, we're actually creating three.
Well, if we go the executive agency route, that is how it would be done. Similar to how NEPA relates to the various bodies. It is somewhat unwieldy, but it is an interim measure that we can implement quickly.
Yeah.
Why go the unwieldy way?
Because
if it is not going to give you the desired result that you're looking for. And just your explanation on the importance of why you want to merge strengthens my point. Because if it is not working currently as is now, as it ought to, I would have expected that there would have been some urgency in getting the thing done, and done properly, instead of going on unwieldy way. That's like cutting off your nose to spite your face and say you look good when you're looking ugly. You know, and PS, for too long we have really just peddled around the matter of public transport. And the issue of, even in the KMTR, the license with the JUTC, even now, which is even getting worse, where the JUTC is supposed to provide 25,000 seats on a daily basis, and we're falling way below that, then the license itself needs to be looked at.
I think, do we now have Mr. Morgan?
yes.
All right. Well, Mr. Morgan, I suppose better late than never.
Better you not say that.
Perhaps you could introduce yourself and the others who came with you.
Cecil Morgan, Managing Director of the Transport Authority.
Your team member.
Trekeen Williams, Corporate Communications Manager, Transport Authority.
Audley Carter, General Manager, Operations, Transport Authority.
Thank you. We seem to have a no more than 2 mics at a time situation that we're working with. Well, welcome, Mr. Morgan and your team.
Thank you, sir.
We've had an overview from the Auditor General on the main issues we wanted to discuss this morning, and the PS has valiantly attempted to keep the dialogue going on issues which really required your presence. So we're glad to have you here now. The first issue that I had raised, and I'd like to hear your views on, relate to the fact that the issuing of summonses and the fact that there are outstanding summonses against an individual licensee is not being treated as a basis for non-renewal of the licensee's license. And the PS has said, well, there are provisions in the Road Traffic Act that aren't in the Transport Authority Act and so on. But nobody has a right to a license. A license is a discretionary privilege granted by the relevant authority. And in deciding whether or not to grant or to renew, the conduct of the driver and the way in which they've operated under the license is something which should be taken into account. You may say that if somebody has an existing license, there's a legitimate expectation that their license will be reviewed as long as they're not using the license or operating under the license in a manner that would suggest that the public interest would be served by not renewing it. But where they have outstanding summonses, how can that just be routinely ignored? Because what we seem to have is a system where there is a priority, or there is a preferable situation that exists if you're operating illegally. And we've seen apparently the data suggesting that the volume of applications for licenses is actually declining, and the number of illegal operators may be growing, which suggests that they're able to operate with impunity. Even though we have data to suggest that 60-something thousand summonses have been issued, 68,043 enforcement summonses issued in the Kingston Metropolitan Transport Region between 2012-13 and 2016-17. We don't have any data on what happened with those summonses, how many persons were convicted, how many fines were imposed or other sanctions imposed on persons, how many persons just received a summons and nothing further happened. But the fact that we have such a large number of persons operating outside the system in the transport sector, and apparently declining numbers of applicants, suggests that the approach to enforcement is lacking. And we see it every day on the road, I must tell you. I mean, there apparently seems to be either no road code or their own road code applicable to taxi drivers. Yeah, and that is not provided for in the law. So I would appreciate your response on the question of why it is that summonses are not, outstanding summonses against a driver or a licensee is not a grounds for declining or renewal of the license.
Chairman, but just before you
yes,
go to Mr. Morgan, perhaps we ought to disaggregate the because we're speaking to the issuance of summonses, but very often these are not issued to the operators. They're issued. The summonses are issued to the drivers, and those are two separate categories. So to link the operators, the owner of these vehicles, with a summons which has been issued to the driver, seems incongruous. We ought to rethink.
No, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what Mr. Campbell is saying. Is he saying that the operator who employs the driver bears no responsibility for the behavior of that driver, I mean, that can't make sense.
The operator should be fully liable.
Yes, the operator,
driver.
since he makes the determination of who he employs to drive his vehicles, he must have some responsibility. Certainly the driver also has responsibility, but you can't divorce the operator from who he employs to drive his vehicle.
What we may need to do is to consider a piece of legislation which would make him responsible. Because in the same way we have U-drive operators, we can't say that when you come and hire my vehicle and you go on the road and you kill someone, that you make the U-drive operator responsible for the person to whom he hires his vehicle. So I think we ought to separate.
There are two different issues, though. I'm not talking about, and none of us are talking about imposing legal liability on somebody for somebody else's conduct where the law doesn't already do so. Now, typically an employer is liable for an employee's negligence in the course of his employment. That's vicarious liability. It's a basic concept. But the question that I was asking was in the context of the renewal of a license application, all factors can be taken into account. And if this operator who is licensed has employed drivers that have outstanding summonses, that is something which ought to be used, in my view, as a way of changing conduct on the road. Because what is happening now is that the way in which cars are being driven on the road is a sort of free-for-all situation.
Yes, I appreciate your point, Chairman, but I'm saying we may need to go a little further, because to just blanketly get up and say, you've issued 60,000 tickets, and just those 60,000 operators who, just to say, okay, go ahead and assign blame to the operators who may very well not know of what has happened, transpired on the roadway. So I think it is...
what kind of enforcement system do we have if 68,000 summonses are issued and operators don't even know that the vehicles that they have on the road are being driven by persons that have summonses?
Chairman, that is something that we need to delve into, but certainly to assign to the...
I didn't really want to come to have discussion between us. I'd like to hear Mr. Morgan's position on this issue. So please let me hear your position, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The matter relating to the issuing of road licenses is between the Transport Authority, the owner, and it is tied to a particular vehicle. Now, the point being raised as it relates to the driver being given a number of summonses and don't turn up at court, or even if they turn up and they're found guilty. What we're doing and what we're saying now, and we're in agreement that there should be some liability at the extent where the owner will have to be addressed. And that is part of and parcel of what is being proposed by Minister Montague as it relates to persons who would have been in breach, and the whole matter of the drivers, not only the drivers will be sanctioned, but also the owners will be sanctioned. These are part and parcel of the policy prescription that is being placed forward. In addition, there's the whole matter of the Suspension and Revocation Act, which are currently being discussed right now at the Licensing Committee, which will bar persons if they continuously create problems for us on the road, licensed operators. So when the time comes for renewal, that will be taken into consideration.
Chair, and before you came, I was asking about that policy, because my understanding it has been in limbo for quite a while, the revocation. But it comes back, and the Auditor General mentioned in her report on page 8 about your road operation management system, the RAM. And in her observation is that it is not being used to its full potential. Yeah? Now, when was it that the Transport Authority had purchased the system? How long now?
To the best of my knowledge, that system was developed and implemented about 3-4 years ago.
About 4 years ago?
Yes.
All right. But what it is that you said that the minister had announced and you're trying to achieve would be greatly enhanced if the system was working to its full potential.
And that's correct.
Because you're still entering some of your information manually instead of doing it through the ROM system. Now, how will you achieve what it is that you are claiming without utilizing the system up to its full potential? Because talk is cheap now, we can talk all we want. But if you're not using, and you've spent 51,000 US dollars on this system, but it's still yet entering your information manually. Hence why, when you have, Chairman, you have persons coming to renew their license. One, you don't have a revocation policy. And two, you don't have the information at hand to guide you whenever these renewals come up. So as the Auditor General claims in her report, a person can get 10 summonses, but still you're renewing his license. So what is it that between the ministry itself and the Transport Authority is going to be doing between now and the end of this financial year that will change this situation?
Okay, the suspension and revocation policy will be enacted. It will be.
When?
Well, I can't say exactly when, but I'm sure before the end of this financial year, it will be enacted. That's one. Two, as it relates to the utilization of the road operations management system, that in itself, it's not being utilized the way it should, because we're having some challenges as it relates to, it's a web-based application, and there are certain locations that we cannot get that kind of performance as it relates to the utilization of it. For example, it will perform reasonably well downtown in Halfway Tree, but when you go into Stony Hill and places like those,
I understand that, you know.
There's a challenge.
But I understand that, and it is said in the report that you don't have the connection, internet connection or data connection in some areas, but it can be manually, the information can be manually uploaded to the system once they come into office, which is still not being done. So if it is not being done when they come into office and you're still operating manually, then for me and to the taxpayers, we have wasted this $51,000.
There's a point of correction there.
Yeah.
It is being done. The exact thing that you mentioned, right? Where the back office operations, where the inspectors will go on the road, capture the information, and then we'd have a back office operation where the data is entered into the system. That is currently being done as we speak. Are you happy at the level of the back office operation?
No, I wouldn't say. Are you happy with the level of backup?
I'm not saying that I'm happy at this particular point in time, but what I can assure you, right, that we are in the process of rolling this mechanism out to the other regions, right?
But how are you going to send it out to the other regions and you don't even master the KMTR yet?
No, as I said, member, the fact is that the only challenge that we do have is when we go on the road and we try to do real-time operations with the application. That is the challenge that we currently have. So the decision was taken that we would, instead of going on the road and you stop a vehicle and then you take minutes before you can load the application properly and to input the information and to frustrate the motorists, we say let's capture the information manually and then you'll come to the office and then you'll input the information. That will allow for us to do the kind of analysis that we currently do. What we need to do is to ensure that the Suspension and Revocation Act is passed so that we can utilize that when somebody comes to renew their road licenses.
There are provisions in the Road Traffic Act for suspension and revocation.
Yes.
It's a policy.
It's a policy.
And the modalities for operationalizing that policy, including information being in the right place so the decision can be made. Those are the problems with why this is hasn't been happening. And we need this to happen. I mean, do you have, for example, a data file on each licensee that would have in it the kind of history of any issues that may be related to that license during its currency? Does that exist for each licensee?
Yes, that currently exists.
And if a driver that is operating under that license has outstanding summonses issued by the Transport Authority, that would be in that file for that license? That information would be there on
our licensing management system would have basically all the information relating to the vehicle and the owner. We have another database which was established that captures information for all transaction that goes to the court. So it would capture the information relating to the driver, the owner, and the vehicle at that particular point in time.
And those two systems are linked?
They are not integrated as yet.
They're not?
They're not. And I think that's one of the challenges that was mentioned by the Auditor General, the lack of integration for some of the systems that we have.
Member Bunting, you wanted to say?
Yes, I have two questions. And before you came, Mr. Morgan, I was referring to meetings that I participated in at least 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know if members might recall, we had a whole series of bus accidents between Mandeville and Christiana where a lot of Homewood and school children were fatal victims. And at the time, it emerged that a number of these drivers had scores of outstanding traffic tickets and also summonses that were issued from the Transport Authority. And from that time, we made a request, we being the Ministry of National Security and its agencies, that the Transport Authority take into consideration when renewing either the driver badges or the operator licenses, these outstanding, well, the driver record essentially based on the tickets, whether or not they were paid, but the tickets and the summonses that were issued. So I am astonished to read this morning or to learn from the Auditor General that years later, 5 years on, this is still not being taken into account when these renewals are being done. And I really would like to ask, what do you take into account when you are renewing a driver badge or an operator license if the actual performance and the breaches of the law are not taken into account? I would like to know what do you take into account? That's the first question. And the second question perhaps is more for Colonel Carter, who I think was introduced as a compliance, what is the title you were given?
General Manager Operations.
General Manager of Operations. But you would, I imagine, have to do with the licenses being issued and surrendered in that role? Well, well, let me say with you then, Mr. Morgan, whoever is doing that is in charge of that. The Transport Authority in 2016-17 issued only approximately a third of the licenses that were surrendered. So in a sense, the announcement that the minister made about freeing up the system is already underway, because if 4,000 persons surrendered, or 6,000 odd persons surrendered licenses and only 2,000 applied for new licenses, I'm sure it's not that there are a lot fewer persons taking these transport operators. It's just that the system is deregulating itself, and there's obviously no effective enforcement and compliance taking place out there. So I would like you to explain how, in the face of this trend, and it's a trend decline, it's not just a 1-year blip, it's a trend decline, that you people continue to collect your salaries and say that you're doing an enforcement job, when from the figures here it seems that you're collecting it under false pretenses.
So there are two questions for you, Mr. Morgan. The first is, what do you, as a Transport Authority, consider what do you consider when deciding whether to renew a license or not? And the second question relates to the whole question of enforcement and the trends that we're seeing, which appear to indicate that increasingly persons are operating outside of the license system because the applications are significantly less than the surrenders, but we know that the demand for public transportation isn't going down. So if you could address those two, please.
Let me take the second one first. The period over which Mr. Bunting spoke, that is for real. However, I must indicate that for the last 2 years, there has been a substantial increase in the number of applications and licenses that has been issued by the Transport Authority. On average, 53,000 per year were the licenses being offered or processed. Last year, we processed 59,000 plus licenses last year. This licensing period, at the last check, let's say last week, up and last week, at the same time last year, we were 6,000 licenses ahead of last year. So the point I want to make is that over the last 2 years, the Transport Authority has modified its system, its processes, and based on that, we are able to process and produce more licenses than ever in the history of the Transport Authority during any financial year.
And the other question, what is it that you consider when deciding whether or not to renew a license?
First and foremost, there's an examination of the motor vehicles to ensure that they fit within the categories, and also as it relates to the structural credibility of the vehicle. We vet the documentation as it relates to the motor vehicles, registration, insurance, and fitness, etc. The owners, they have to submit a police record. They have to submit TRN, and they have to submit proper documentation. Also, there is a check made by the Transport Authority for the verification of any outstanding tickets from the TTMS system. Those are the steps that we use initially to verify, to determine the suitability of an applicant as it relates to the processing of a license.
Ticketing, the ticket record is of who that you check? When if an owner is seeking to renew the transport license for his vehicle to be on the road, whose ticketing record are you checking?
The owner.
Does he have to submit who his drivers are? Is that part of the knowledge base that you have as to who's driving this vehicle on the road under this license?
Sometimes they do, and when you come to apply for a badge, for example, a driver would come to apply for a badge, would also check that system to verify if they have outstanding tickets. And also, as I said before, what we would also check is to ensure proper identification and to ensure also that they have the correct, or well, not correct, but they don't have a police record which would make them ineligible for them to operate on the road.
For Member Hannah, is there any thought to requiring vehicle tracking on PPV vehicles, where you require a vehicle to have a device that is transmitting all the relevant data about that vehicle while it's on the road, and which would feed into a database that could be used to create a kind of passport or a performance record on the person's file that could be then used to decide whether or not this person is worthy of having a license?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Chairman, because that is part and parcel of the proposal, right, that will be put forward to the owners in the public passenger vehicle system. We're going to use either RFID or we're going to use a GPS system. Right now, the Transport Authority is in the process of establishing a command center, which will allow us to A, either utilize GPS or RFID to be able to track all public passenger vehicles, because we recognize the importance of tracking these vehicles. Safety, security, and I'm sure Mr. Bunting is very much aware of the importance of it. Also, we plan to utilize our camera links at our various locations from a security standpoint. And also, we plan to partner with the National Works Agency to establish the feed that they have, which will help us in monitoring and operations on the roadways. So we are actually actively pursuing that initiative. And I'm happy to say that before the end of the next quarter, that will become a reality.
Mr. Chairman, just before you go to, because it don't make sense, all of us keep asking the questions, but I'm not sure we're getting the answers to the questions. And I still don't have not resolved in my own mind the question I asked and reconcile it with the report of the Auditor General. The Auditor General speaks to the trend decline in the licenses and the excess of the licenses surrendered versus renewed licenses. But on the other hand, Mr. Morgan says that in the last 2 years, which overlaps one of the years that the Auditor General is dealing with, that's record numbers of licenses are being issued. So I'm just trying to get, and I really ask my colleague, Ms. Hannah, to just...
No, that's a reasonable follow-up. And in fact, the Auditor General did indicate that the numbers might not be agreed on both sides, so to speak. But
yeah. Chairman, it is quite simple, to be honest with you. There's no direct correlation between, somebody who has surrendered and, renewal. There's also the fact that you have new entrants, new applicants coming into the business. That would account for the additional influx of new licenses. And that's what we're saying. Even though the trend that they would have seen is correct, because of the steps that the Transport Authority has taken, the whole improvement in our processes, we have been able to get new entrants in which will clearly offset those who would have left the system.
Well,
So
could you then explain to me, how does 2,189 new entrants offset 6,524 licenses which were surrendered in 2016-17, which is, just within the 2-year period you've spoken to?
So I didn't get that.
in the data we have, in the period 2016-17, in that year, 6,524 route taxis and stage carriage licenses were surrendered, 6,500. In the same period, 2,189 new licenses were issued. All right? That suggests about a third of the volume of what is being surrendered is being issued in new licenses. A two-thirds attrition rate leaving the system, probably to be operating illegally, some of them. So how does that square with what you're telling us about the volume growing?
I think I overheard you mention, Chairman, that the Auditor General mentioned that there may be, us and them may be at variations as it relates to the numbers. But what we are quite clear on is the number of licenses that we processed last year. It was 59,000 plus
okay,
licenses.
so you're changing from last year, no? You said originally last 2 years.
No.
One of which overlapped with the year we're looking at.
Right, and I'm speaking about the year 17-18 and the year 18-19, because we are in agreement, that there had been a decline.
So when you said the last 2 years, you're referring to 18-19, which we have just started.
No, 17-18.
And 16-17.
And 18-19.
Okay, well, 18-19 is not the last 2 years. 18-19, we're still in the first quarter of 18-19.
And I made the point clear that we are 6,000 ahead of where we were at this time last year.
Okay.
So just to make the point, Mr. Bunting, there had been a decline, and we are very much aware of that. And it is on that basis that we made changes to our approach to licensing. We also opened the market, and we offered a number of new licensing aspects on the market. Hence, persons came in, a number of new entrants came in, and that's why we were able to produce so much during the period 17-18 and now 18-19.
Auditor General, do you want to ask a question?
So, and just to understand, no, you're not really in conflict with the Auditor General because she was speaking to the 16-17 period, primarily these figures that I quoted. So you have no, you're not contending that. You're accepting the 16-17, and you're now saying that in 17-18 and in the first quarter of the current year, you have started reversing that. Is it?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Ms. Hannah.
Morning, colleagues. This question is for the Auditor General, actually. The Appendix 2, the All-Island Feasibility Study of 2012, was there an updated feasibility study that you had access to?
Yeah, we had access to the 2015 study for KMTR.
So this is, to date, the only study that we have. There are two questions, right? If you would permit me, Chairman, a little latitude to just ask a series of questions. After what Bunting did, you cannot stop me. I think all of us in Jamaica want discipline on our roads. That's one. And two, all of us want a transportation system that is viable and that is rationalized across the board so that it is not only Kingston, but the other parishes that actually have access to licensed public transportation that's safe, that's fit, that's affordable, and that's efficient. What I have an understanding of, seeing it operate in my own constituency, is the difficulty that my own local police have and the Transport Authority has in managing illegal taxi operators. I also recognize that because of the inadequacy of public transportation, that from time to time, people who have to make a living and who have a car resort to picking up and dropping off persons to have a livelihood for their families. Now, under the rule of law, if you're breaking the rules, then there's a system that comes into play. So here are my questions. It appears that the Transport Authority makes its money from enforcement and from the issuing of license, correct?
That's correct.
So that's where your income comes from. What is currently your operational budget annually?
It's about 1.1 billion.
1.1 million. What percentage of that is used for enforcement nationally?
Approximately 40%.
40%, and the rest is used for taking care of salaries. So you have about 500.
Not salaries alone.
Salaries
it's made
and
up of other administrative costs.
Okay.
Remember, our primary set of activity, is really the issuing of licenses.
And that's why I want to focus a little bit on that, Chairman. And here's why. If we don't provide a cushion for people to adequately do their work, and this is not, I'm not taking up for you for abrogating any responsibility that you might have. But oftentimes, and being a former minister, if we don't have the money to have staff effectively implement what they have to govern, then you have a problem, because I see it in here where you're issuing a whole heap of licenses. If you take into consideration the same survey from 2012, I see where you have in St. Elizabeth a number of licenses being issued, but you still have a shortage of about 410 licensed vehicles in St. Elizabeth. So there's a definite imbalance with you making money, providing adequate transport for people in Jamaica, but your reliance seems to be on making money at this point. And I think the conflict that we face at this committee is trying to identify how we make sure that you and your stakeholders do their job, but how do we identify the gap between the Transport Authority making money and successfully making sure that we have disciplined, licensed operators on the road? Because if this system of how they make money continues, you will never have a system where they can actually find a mechanism for enforcement. And one of the things I can say, being a Jamaican myself and understanding it, is a Jamaican can either conform very well to a system or beat a system very, very well. So, Chairman, I would like to find out a little bit more from the Auditor General and the team, really and truly how they're going to solve this particular feasibility across the board in terms of providing. No, but the Auditor General herself says she hasn't seen a plan in the report itself for a long-term solution. So she has to be able to tell us in her analysis if that is sustainable, and they have to tell us what is their sustainable plan, because one doesn't exist. So we can sit here the entire day going through how much license, how much summons, etc., but there's still no long-term solution for solving that conflict.
The conflict you're referring to is what? The gap between the needs and the availability of...
And providing the relevant and necessary numbers of vehicles on the road. It's one thing to monitor illegal taxis and buses, you know, but there's another thing, there's another responsibility they have, and that is to make sure that there are adequate cars, licenses, licensed PP operators, and fill the shortage at some point of cars on the road.
But I think one of the underlying arguments that the data throws up is whether people are effectively deregulating themselves and providing the service without licenses because the enforcement is so poor. Yeah. Remember, then there was a couple of people who had put up there, member Phillips and I think member Jackson and member Guy.
Yeah, but before I go, you wanted to say something before? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think that any entity's sustainability would be questioned if they're lacking a plan. Suffice to say, the TA provided us with audited financial statements, and what we would report here would have been based on our analysis. My understanding, however, and for the information that I reviewed, did not allow us, though we attempted to do that, to disaggregate the expenses into the various activities, so it could be assessed the cost to undertake monitoring activities vis-a-vis enforcement and licensing activities. I noted from the response that TA provided that there was an indication that for public awareness, 50 million was spent, and let me not hazard a guess what was said for the licensing activity. However, I am not aware as to how they determined that figure, because that was not discernible from the financial information. And that's an important point. You see, the timeliness of financial information is critical for decision making, but more important is the relevance of that financial information. And so it must be possible that whatever is available can be disaggregated into the major business processes. It is only on that basis that I would be able to make an assessment as whether we're getting value for money from the enforcement activities, the monitoring activities vis-a-vis the licensing activities, as well as to indicate what is spent on one vis-a-vis another. So it would be premature premature of me at this point in time to suggest that they are not properly funded, because the information has not been presented in a manner to suggest that it's not properly funded, because you can look at it from various angles. Whether overall as an entity, is it properly funded, or is the resources misallocated between the various business processes?
Yeah, member for this.
Just want some clarity, Chair, because in the issuance or renewal of license, you said that you were 6,000 ahead of last year.
That's good. At this point in time.
At this point in time. All right, how many, if you can give me the information now, how many licenses were renewed last year, and how many new ones that you would have processed? Because if, reason why I'm asking, because it's a little bit unclear, Chairman. If you have persons surrendering license and you have more persons surrendering license than you have license issued, I'm not seeing the net result being an increase over the year before. So, yeah. So if you can give me the gross numbers of how many that you renewed compared to the new ones that you issued.
I don't have all the details here that you're asking for, but remember we issue licenses, red plates and green plates.
All right.
So
the green plates are the commercial carriers.
Right, the commercial carriers.
So you're putting everything together.
Total.
Because in the report I see where you have the increased take up of the green plates has been dramatic. Yeah? Can you then segregate the numbers for me of the PPV compared to the Hackney carriage?
Hackney and contract carriage licenses.
Right.
Those are the two we're interested in, separate from the commercial vehicles.
Okay.
I mean, we're talking about public passenger vehicles.
Yeah,
the commercial.
In commercial vehicle licensing, we're talking about the public transportation.
No, because you had me confused a little bit, because I was wondering how you had a net surplus over the year before compared to. But if we were to look at the numbers here.
Because when we speak of issuing licenses at the transport.
No, reasonable. So we
speak of both the
now.
green plates and the.
So do you have a breakdown of what is PP route taxes separate from Hackney?
We can get that for you, member.
All right. So, okay.
Even for 17-18, you may not have it for the current year, but can you give us for 17-18 the amount of Hackney and contract carriage licenses that were issued versus surrendered?
Until you get that, I think you're trying to. The issue of the Hackney carriage. The issue of Hackney carriage. Because the Hackney carriages are generally issued in the KMTR.
Right. You want to know the numbers we have for new licenses, new Hackney carriage licenses issued?
Go ahead.
For the 2016, January to December, 175 were issued.
100 and what?
175.
New?
New.
Okay.
January to December 2017, 535. And to date, January to date, 103. A total of 813 Hackney carriage licenses have been issued.
From 2016 to now?
Right, that's correct.
Right. And you have any numbers of those that have been revoked during the same period? Or surrendered in the same period? No?
I don't think that type of license is not usually surrendered.
All right, but let me ask you though, wasn't there a moratorium on Hackney carriage license?
Yes, that's correct.
And when was that moratorium in place, and have that moratorium been lifted?
2016.
It was lifted in 2016.
That's correct.
It was advertised?
It was.
It was advertised?
Yes.
But because what you have in the KMTR now are really the Hackney carriages that is running on what is supposed to be the JUTC routes. Huh? What is the level of enforcement with that now? Because, and I asked a question before you came, and I would imagine that it would rest as a policy with the ministry itself. As the JUTC itself is in breach of its own, of its contract, of not being able to provide the seats that is necessary in the KMTR. Seeing that those routes that there is a shortfall, and you now have illegal, be that they are Hackney carriages, but they are illegally on the routes of the JUTC. I have not, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I just want, even as Mr. Morgan contemplates that question, just want to point out that the CEO of the JUTC is also here, and he can speak to how it impacts his operation as well.
I see him around the back. Yeah.
That's Mr. Paul Abrams.
Yes. What is it that the ministry is doing to, one, assist, this is for you, PS, in dealing with the shortfall from the JUTC, and second, from the TA's standpoint, in dealing with what is an illegal activity now from these Hackney carriages? How, because they have to work in tandem, how is that being dealt with at this point in time?
In terms of the shortfall from the JUTC had over time, in fact, assessed its fleet and have given projection beginning in 2015 up to 2020, and have indicated there's need for additional fleet. The Ministry of Finance, recognizing the fiscal space situation, had in fact committed to giving JUTC additional funds to buy spare parts and to do refurbishing and repairs of buses, because there were a significant number that were there that were not operational. So the JUTC had been trying to keep its fleet.
But you and I know, though, PS, that is something you put on paper, but we know that's not the reality.
The fact of the matter is that they have not been able to increase the fleet significantly. So at the end of the day, there's still going to be need for additional buses. But there is a shortfall, and that shortfall has to be addressed. We don't think the Hackney carriage route is the way to go. And the JUTC, there is a provision for JUTC to issue sub-license, and I know the CEO of JUTC can speak to this.
Let me tell you why I asked the question, Chairman. The JUTC is supposed to provide 25,000 seats on a daily basis. The Transport Authority did a survey some time ago to say that there's 31,000 seats that's required in the KMTR. The JUTC itself is not able to provide that 25. So you have a big shortfall. But if it is that you have that shortfall, especially on even some of the profitable routes that the JUTC is running, and you have not issued new license for those routes, and you have Hackney carriages running on it, I mean, the passengers needs to be moved. Yeah? So,
is there a restriction on the Hackney carriage operator operating on a JUTC route?
Mm-hmm.
There is. Yeah. And how is that enforced?
They can operate anywhere so long as they operate in keeping with their license, which is to pick up a person from point A to point B. So it could overlap with a JUTC route. The fact is, though, if they are picking up passengers, running along the route, stopping at bus stop, pick up, let off, then yes, that is illegal.
Which is what is happening now, and you can't blame them because there's a shortfall.
So I'm
just asking, moving forward, what is it that between the Transport Authority and the Ministry in dealing with that issue? Because a policy has been given that there's no new buses till 2020, 2021. The JUTC is, and Mr. Abrams is here, so he can answer, is not getting the required spare parts on time. Because the minister stood up inside here to say that nearly 100 buses had to be parked the other day when the rain was falling. Because you never have prop rubber, you never have windscreen wiper, you never have all sorts of stuff. He said it in his own presentation. So if those simple things cannot be had, I can imagine the rest of parts that needs to be gotten is not being gotten by the JUTC. So immediately, with what is happening on the road, what is going to be the policy moving forward? Are you going to be issuing license for some of those routes? Are you going to allow the chaos to continue? What is going to happen?
No, in terms of the parts, the Ministry of Finance has been forthcoming in providing the funds that were budgeted for parts. And it's really the JUTC to prioritize what parts
Mr. Abrams is here, but I challenge you on that.
In terms of the shortfall, the dynamics is there are a number of factors that affect it. The physical number of buses is one, but there's also the whole traffic management situation and how many trips the bus can make in a day. And significant amount of improvements are taking place on some of the major JUTC trunk routes. They have been severely impacted by the removal of that lane on the Mandela Highway. And then the works now going on Constant Spring Road and to start on Hagley Park Road is also impacting. So you could have, so that would also impact the number of trips that they are able to make in a day, and therefore in terms of providing the number of seats that are required. And those are static number of seats, but it's really number of buses times the number of trips that would give you the number of seats that are required. So these have to be worked through to determine how much the bus count need to be improved, and at the same time how we can keep a service going for the commuting public without inconveniencing them too much by the shortfall of seats. And that is where, as I said, the sub-franchise and sub-license should be used to, rather than the Hackney carriage that are operating now.
Mr. Abrams can answer for himself if I'm getting enough parts. Sure. But
weren't we told that there's going to be unlimited issuance of Hackney carriage licenses? Isn't that the proposal from the minister? That the market will just determine how many.
Yeah. I just want to ask though, just because I have to leave. On page 8, number 4, on the assets, purchasing of assets, and I come back to the purchase of in 2016 of 5 buses. And I remember the last time Managing Director was here, you had purchased 5 buses, Golden Dragon buses, and you had said that the buses came and they were not of the required size and specification of what you needed. Then, sorry? Yeah. So why then buy the buses?
We came and we paid for the buses, sir.
Sorry?
We paid for the buses.
No, I said then why then buy them if they were,
I'm saying
after they came here and they're not up.
They were ordered.
Why buy them if they're not of the requirements?
They were ordered and we had to pay for them.
Who ordered them?
They were ordered by the previous members of the board.
So let me ask you a question. When were the buses paid for?
They were paid for in 2016. But they were ordered prior to.
So why then didn't the new board then, if saw that, did not then stop the purchasing of the buses since you paid for the buses when the new board came? What?
They were built to order, sir. They were built to order.
Huh? When did the new buses, when in 2016 were the buses paid for?
I think it's probably about June, July, somewhere around there.
Had management recommended the purchase of those buses? Boards don't typically make those decisions in isolation of management's recommendation.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I said before, those orders were already placed.
and the buses came sometime in the
I'm
latter
asking,
part.
were those buses selected based on management's recommendation at the time?
I can't speak to that, sir.
No, but it is.
Well, why can't you speak to that? You weren't there then?
No, I wasn't there at the time.
Oh.
Mr. On that point, with the permission of my colleague, I'm very much interested in that response. I heard you, Mr. Morgan, that the order preceded your tenure, but you now was saddled with meeting that obligation. A couple of things that comes to my mind, and it came up here before. We are hearing that the bus couldn't perform in the conditions that they were to be used in or under. The specification of those buses that were delivered and paid for, was it in keeping with the specification that was made when they were ordered to begin with? In fact, for example, what I'm driving at, when you got the buses and you had to pay for them, were you satisfied that what you're getting is what was ordered by virtue of specification?
Even if it wasn't your board.
Yeah. And I ask that against the background, because you know what, if something flawed happened, whichever administration it is irrelevant. What is important is that the right thing is done at the time when it can be done. So that's why I asked the question, if what you got, because we have heard many instances of these committees, things that are delivered are not in keeping with what the order was. All right, so I just want to verify if what you got was in keeping with what was ordered. And it comes back to the chairman's question, which I think is critical. Did the previous administration ascertain the specification of the buses that would be needed for where they were intended to be used? So we can know if that administration then, the management at the time, made the appropriate or properly informed decision in ordering those buses.
That's a bit challenging, member, but I'll tell you why. When those buses arrived, when those buses came, they were supposed to have been, taking staff members to and from work, primarily. We had a staff conference in Ocho Rios. They couldn't go over Mount Russell.
But
and you asked about specifications. You asked about specifications. Now, I am not in a position to say whether or not all the specifications, what they were before, etc. But all I'm simply saying, in terms of operations, right? Because if 2 buses were bought for the KMTR, which is flat, Montego Bay generally, but the cross-country a different thing. So therefore, if I was making that decision in relation to buying a bus for staff members, I would not have bought those buses, because quite clearly they cannot handle the kind of terrain that it is expected to handle, take staff to and from work. No. So that's a challenge in the first place. So that is on one of the bases on which the decision was taken.
To sell them.
The second thing is, when you look at an office NRO, probably about 30 persons, made up of administrative staff plus inspectors. You might have about 12 inspectors who have to come to work like 6 o'clock in the morning. You don't need a 40-seater bus to be going around, picking up 12 passengers. So what we have done, we have sold the 5 buses.
You have sold them already?
We have. And I've said that to Mr. Phillips already.
Caribbean Maritime University bought them.
Okay.
We have sold them. And I must say we apologize for being late here this morning, because guess what? We bought 3 buses, 2 coaster and a highest buses. And we handed those over to the KMTR staff members this morning. And we're in the process of buying another 5 more smaller buses to be utilized in the regions to take the staff to and from. So what we did, we basically did our analysis and recognized getting 40-seater buses to operate in St. Anne, St. Mary, Manchester is not the way to go.
No, I just close. I appreciate that, but I still would want to know. I don't expect you to necessarily have the information.
Yes.
But I'm curious to know, in placing those orders, if the specs on those buses is one that could do for the intended use. Because I say I've seen many instances, cases come up where what the agency pays for is not necessarily what they have ordered.
Well, I'll get that information for you.
Okay, thanks.
When did you join the Transport Authority, Mr. Morgan?
June 1, 2016.
Okay. And who was your predecessor?
Mr. Donald Foster. Yes, I rejoined in 2016. Thank you, sir.
So Morgan, what is a little challenging for me is because you said that the buses were ordered. My understanding, a deposit on those buses were not made prior to the payment that was made by the Transport Authority for the buses. A new board came in, yeah? And I just want to know, why is it then that that board did not then, if they figured that the buses were not what they wanted, why then pay for the buses and take possession? 3 buses went to the Caribbean Maritime University. Have you been paid for those 3 buses? And 2 went to the JUTC. So 2 of them is now a part of the fleet of the JUTC. You have spent $115 million on these 5 buses. Yeah? And are you being able to collect what you said, a lease agreement with? It's 5 buses, so 3 to Caribbean. 5. No, 5. It's 5 buses in total. It's 5 buses in total.
Yes, well, in fact, I have the information right here as it relates to payment from the Caribbean Maritime Institute.
Okay, so you have been paid for those.
We have been paid for, and also
and are you collecting from the?
We have been paid to date for the buses lease. The arrangement with us on the JUTC, approximately $1 million, have been paid by the JUTC.
How much?
Approximately $1 million so far, and that's recent. We entered into the agreement with them January of this year, and so far they have kept their obligations.
So they are up to date with their payment?
That's correct.
Well,
That's correct.
That's commendable.
Between the 2 entities, what is the total net revenue to you for those?
I think we spent about $115 million overall for the 5
buy
buses.
them. But how much you're selling them for?
The CMU went into an arrangement for $15 million cash and $5 million training for each bus. That's about $20 million
15
per bus.
Sorry, repeat those numbers.
It's about $22 million those buses were bought for. For the CMU, for each bus, $15 million in terms of cash payment over an assured period, right?
Yes,
and also $5 million worth of training, right?
Okay,
So it's approximately $20 million.
Okay. So that training is a discounted price for the $5 million?
And I'm sure you'd be happy to be part of that, sir. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Dunn, long-suffering Dunn. Your long-suffering is done
Chairman,
now.
you're talking about the robot taxis, and can see how badly I was driven on the road.
Better late than never.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And in fact, you're actually, you skipped the line because it was Mr. Guy, Dr. Guy is ahead of you. But go ahead. Given your forlorn appearance, I don't want to.
I'd like to thank the Managing Director, right, for the stewardship so far, and especially with those buses, to have made a bad decision no right. So that's very commendable, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to also say that I noticed generally as a country, and I'm agreeing with the Auditor General about compliance and getting value for money, that we tend to spend so much money on enforcement rather than encourage compliance. We speak about the robo-taxis and other persons on the road not being licensed. And I'm also happy that Member Hannah brought up this point, because the minister in his presentation did speak to issues dealing with the gap that exists with the formal operators and informal operators. So that would answer that particular question. But my question is, why is it that we have to spend so much money generally on enforcement? And what is it that we're doing, especially in the KTMR area, to look at that gap that exists, and how can we satisfy that gap by encouraging just compliance generally?
In terms of I'm not sure if you're reading from the document here, which indicated that $4.8 billion was spent on enforcement. In fact, we had this discussion with the Auditor General, and we made it quite clear that we didn't spend $4.8 billion on enforcement. In fact, what we did, we spent approximately $2.04 billion over the 5 years on enforcement directly, right? And, as I said before, licensing is a major, major part of what we do in terms of the production, et cetera, and administrative staff. So we recognize that, yes, we should be, want to encourage more persons to come into the formal sector. And that is why, we are putting together this whole matter of those 16 points that the minister had raised in the sectoral debate to indicate that, listen, we're going to open up, especially the routes. We're going to categorize and segment routes in such a way that, we're going to make it more affordable, so that, we have premium routes and you have, secondary, tertiary routes. And all the other things in terms of trying to ensure that we get persons to conform as it relates to the proper standards as it relates to public passenger operations. So the whole matter of GPS or RFID will definitely be there. We are in the process of developing an application now where, a person who wants to take a bus or a taxi can basically check and verify whether or not, this is a legitimate operator. These are some of the things that we will be putting in place, and I've spoken about the command center that we're in the process of establishing. So we want to have a safer, a more reliable, and we want to ensure that persons who are not fit and proper to be in the business should not be in the business. So the idea of opening up the space in such a way that you can have more players coming in is part and parcel of our objective. The idea of ensuring that there are persons who are fit and proper, because we don't want to have some of the things that we are hearing happening in the sector continues. We want to ensure that if there are persons who would violate, that they can be easily be brought to books. So we are looking from a security standpoint, we are looking at working very close to the police, and I want to mention this. I've seen where in the report, and I've made it quite clear, that there are some things that the public sees out there. They see a lot of bad driving, no parking in reckless driving, careless driving. And we are saying, we have said it to the Auditor General, and we are saying it again. The Transport Authority has no jurisdiction, absolutely none, over certain elements or certain things that occur in the public space. We are limited in terms of our enforcement capabilities. And we want to let it be clear, and we have made it I want to make it absolutely clear that don't just come at the Transport Authority the way sometimes persons have been. And I'm not saying that we are not at fault at times, don't get me wrong. But the fact of the matter is that we need to ensure,
And a major part of our success will be the enforcement to be carried out by the police. And also, what we want to ensure also from a transport authority standpoint, that we are fair, we are firm, and we ensure that persons adhere to the rule of law. Those are the things that we're looking at. We want to work as part of our consultation. We'll be talking to the insurance companies. We'll be talking to the municipal corporations. We'll be talking to the police and all other areas that work within the transport sector. Because clearly, I say to persons, if you look at the tourism sector, look at how the Juta, the Maxi, and the JCAL operators operate. You don't have this kind of, disturbance and whatever is going on there. So why can't the formal part of the sector? It is simple as it relates to lack of enforcement. The fact of the matter is the Transport Authority, we only have 160 inspectors, as pointed out by the General, island-wide. That is minuscule in terms of
what you do have is the ability to decide whether or not to grant or renew a license.
That is correct, sir.
And if you have the information available to you on the performance around that licensee, you should be able to use that leverage to ensure better compliance. Because what we have is a free-for-all on the road currently, and that's what we need to have.
Especially when the Auditor General's report points out that there are few offenders who keep incurring multiple offenses. So it's not like you have to chase down everybody. You just want to get those who are the determined repeat offenders and target them. And
6,727 PPV operators were repeat offenders, with some committing offenses up to 50 times over a 4-year period.
These are who you must target with the enforcement.
And I agree with you. I agree with you that in terms of those persons, the repeat offenders, they are to be targeted. There's absolutely no way we should allow, a driver to be out there with so many hundreds of tickets operating in the sector. There must be a mechanism, as the writer said, Chairman, to address this. But, one of the challenges we do have, if I may say so, we at the Transport Authority, we prosecute. We take you before the court. And in a lot of instances, when you are found guilty, you are being released back into the system. The laws,
That's where suspension and revocation should come in. You can't tell a judge what the fine the judge imposes will be. That's our judicial discretion.
Yes.
The law will put a maximum, and typically, and they will make a decision based on the facts before you. But the system ought to allow you to ensure that somebody who has been found guilty of a particular offense and ought to have some sanction because they're dealing with the public as a public passenger vehicle operator, that you ensure that that takes place to protect the public. And I think that's where the system is lacking. There isn't that kind of interplay between the outcome in the court proceedings and then what happens in relation to that person's license thereafter. And that's where I think we need to improve those linkages. So that there is a sanction, not just in the court, but in terms of whether or not you can continue as you were before.
And you're perfectly correct, Chairman. And we as I said to you before, we're actively right now tidying up the whole matter of the suspension and revocation, right?
Mr. Chairman, as a follow-up, the Minister of Tourism spoke about the regulation of bed and breakfasts coming soon. What is the possibility of robot taxis establishing themselves in a Juba type, not Uber, but maybe Juba type situation where people can download an app and they pay a fee to the Transport Authority? What are some of the mechanisms that you're using to maybe develop a better stakeholder relationships? Because it seems to me that a trend has developed and it's going to be difficult to overhaul that culture at this point. So what can you do to bring people into the mix so that people feel that you're approachable before you can get the law dealt with in the way that you want to?
The opening up of what we call city taxes, for example. City taxes, it's a proposal. So you don't have to be a route taxi to operate along a specified route. What we're saying is within a radius,
because, you know, we recognize that in the major townships, Mandeville, Maypen, Montego Bay, you may have the need for that kind of a facility. And that is one of the proposal the minister put forward. So that is something that we have to... Sorry, I didn't get it.
So a city taxi is like a hackney carriage, but who can also run on the routes?
Not necessarily.
I'm just trying to understand what the city taxi is.
Mandeville is a city. So there are limits. Let's say, for example, the limit is 5 miles radius, 10 miles, whatever it is. So you will be bounded by that in terms of operations.
But within that, say, I'm just trying to see how it will differ from the hackney carriage, for example.
The hackney carriage, basically, currently, you can operate within 3 parishes.
Within 3 parishes?
That's right.
So this would be a more restrained geographic area.
That's correct.
But it would operate within that restrained geographic area like a hackney carriage?
That's right, sir.
Okay.
Yes, Member Jackson.
Niggling question, and I must tell you, when I hear about the number of summons and all of those breaches and nothing being done, and then I hear about the problem with JUTC, I'm really confused. Earlier on, we were told that the viability of the JUTC was severely compromised by the intrusion of these operators in the routes. And tremendous effort was being made to restrict these vehicles on those routes in order to preserve and enhance the financial viability of the JUTC. It is that viability is going to ensure the sustainability of our urban transit system. Now, Mr. Chairman, when I read the AG report and I listen to the discussion earlier on, I hear about the problems with JUTC and spare parts and not being able to finance those spare parts to just even keep their current level of service going. Juxtapose that with an announcement that says the whole system is open up for anybody who wants to come in it. And I ask myself, is it exactly, isn't this a recipe for the certain and hastened death of the JUTC? And isn't that implicitly a policy decision to kill the JUTC and all the commuters who would be benefiting from the advantage in fares and everything else of JUTC? It is just a vanishing notion for them. Help me to understand, because PS, you are the principal policy advisor in the Ministry of Transport, correct? You are the principal technical advisor to the government. So you being where you are as long as you have been, you know the system and the challenges inside out. So I take it that seized of these challenges, you would have advised the minister in him arriving at this new policy proposed here, the consequences of the existing system being reported to us by the AG. Tell us, where are we going? Are we...
I think your point's yeah, how is this new policy going to impact the JUTC if it's a much more liberalized policy and the JUTC needs protection on its routes from operators that are cannibalizing its customer base?
What we must remember is that the Public Passenger Transport Act, the KMTR area, allows the minister to give one exclusive license, and that exclusive license is granted to the JUTC. Anybody else who operate within that area would have to be sub-licensed to the JUTC. Hackney carriages, however, can operate within the area that they're licensed to operate. And that is where the JUTC has been impacted, and that is where the enforcement of the rules has to take place in a manner that will not allow the hackney carriage, the proliferation of hackney carriage, to undermine the operations of the JUTC. The unfortunate reality has been that it is currently undermining the operations because they are running with impunity on some routes. Even the trunk routes, some school of thought, and we have given it some consideration, that the JUTC should operate on the main trunk routes. But you find routes like Papine to Halfway Tree, for instance, that hackney carriages are carrying more passengers than the JUTC on that route. And it's a critical route where you have a lot of students, and a very busy route, one of the busiest in the country. And we have to redouble our enforcement effort together with the JUTC being able to put the requisite number of buses on the route.
So that is not a very encouraging response. Anyway, any other questions? Yes, Mr. Campbell.
This figure I see of 1.859 billion, which is indicated as the cost of monitoring activities. I have some concern as to what percentage of that sum represents liabilities which is incurred by the TA by virtue of, one, liability which is literally imposed on the TA by virtue of the activities which the police carry out. Because they go in, and I know you have some kind of relationship with them where the seizure takes place and it comes into your campus. And I've heard of cases where you, under your regime, you're able to sell or dispose of those vehicles. And there is not sufficient linkage between yourself and the police, so errors are made. How much of that because I've seen some whopping judgments coming out of the Court of Appeal. I saw one where you were ordered to pay something like $10 million for the loss of a vehicle. And I just want to see how many of those get thrown at you.
Yes, there are instances when, for example, during the conduct of an auction, you know, an error might have been made in terms of the disposal of a vehicle. And I think the one that you referred to, yes, that's for real. But fortunately, the systems that we have employed minimizes, right? You know, the number of those occurrences. And I must add that over the last few years, I've seen probably a total of 2 or 3. And in those instances, you know, the fact is those vehicles, yes, do come into our pounds. But the truth is that when we check with the other agencies, we would not have sold, you know, those vehicles unless clearances have been given by those agencies. For example, tax administration or the police or whatever. But inadvertently, you know, these things do happen. But the truth be told, I'm happy that it's not a whole lot of, you know, that kind of happenings taking place.
There are some which represents the claims which are brought by so-called legal operators, but where your inspectors have wrongly charged these operators.
There is. I really can't give you the exact number here now,
but there are instances where matters were taken before the courts, and the Transport Authority would not have been successful. And for one reason or another, failure to deliver the vehicles on time would result in a loss of use and things like those, and we have to, take that responsibility. So, but I must add, I've seen where over the last, and I can speak specifically again over the last 2 years, where that number had gone down tremendously as it relates to, wrongful seizure, dismissals, et cetera, where the Transport Authority would have paid something like $40 million or something like that, and now we're paying under $6 million per year.
Would you say this is as a result of a more robust system of training of the inspectors?
That too, and we recognize that if you're not sure, you don't.
You don't.
That's right.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the team from the Transport Authority or Ministry? If not, thank you very much, PS. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Thank you, team, for coming, and we appreciate the responses given.
Thank you, Chairman, and the rest of the team. Thank you to the Auditor General and our team also.
Members, in terms of any other business, I would just mention that I've just received a letter from the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, which was one of the matters arising from the minutes in relation to a discussion that was that took place last time, where we'd asked for clarification on certain matters. I would just ask that you circulate a copy to the members so they can see it. Yeah.
Next week, with the 26th and 27th, training for the parliamentarians.
Oh, yes. I'm being reminded by the clerk, and she's asked me to pass this on to you, that there will be an orientation and reorientation seminar for parliamentarians next Tuesday, the 26th, and Wednesday, the 27th, at the Courtyard Marriott Hotel, beginning at 8:30 a.m. and through to 1 p.m. on both days. Is this all parliamentarians? Or is this not the PAC and PAAC?
Module 4, I think, which is, they want
all. They want all. Okay. It says one of the modules, which is Module 4, is on public financial management, designed to explain in detail the legislative function of improving expenditure and revenue proposals of the executive. It will also show how Parliament can play an important role in compelling governments to be more accountable and transparent in the management of public finances. This module will be presented on day 2, which is June the 27th, next week Wednesday, is that right? And the session will be held during the period 11 to 12:45, and will be presented by a panel of key parliamentary staff, including the clerks of the PAC and the PAAC. So we were originally told that this training, or whatever you call it, was for PAC and PAAC members. This is a different thing, or is it the same thing?
No, it was 2 training. One, they want person to participate in both, but there is one specifically designed for PAC and PAAC, so they're encouraging members of those committees to make sure they attend those, even if they don't attend the others.
Oh. All right. Anyway, so next week, Tuesday and Wednesday in the morning from 8:30 at the Courtyard Marriott. Correct. Well, I assume that's correct. No, that's right. All right. So the date of the next meeting? Huh? To be determined, I'm told sheepishly to my left. All right. Yeah, yes. All right. Thank you very much, Madam Auditor General, and everyone else who was here. Thank you for coming. All right. Thank you, members.